Welcome to the West, a Narrative History. This is Chapter 8, The Emergence of Europe, and we're going to talk about how Europe begins to look like it does today. Europe, the word was coined by the Greeks, but it starts to take on a new meaning, referring to the continent that we think of today. And the West itself takes on a little bit new meaning. We're going to talk about the Merovingian kingdom, and that's the kingdom of Clovis, a Frank, for whom France is named. He makes the decision to convert to Christianity, advocates for a blend of German with Roman Christian traditions, and this makes the Merovingian dynasty important in the foundation of Western civilization. The Franks' neighbors of some other important tribes in the history of Western civilization, the Lombards in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Anglo Saxons in Britain. Ireland's kind of on its own, establishing its own customs. Um, the Merovingian family, they become weak and they really lose their power, and then they become supplanted by the Carolingian officials in the early 8th century. And Charles Martel, he becomes the important leader in the new Carolingian Empire when he defeats the Muslims invading France in 732. Pepin III replaces the Merovingians and calls on the Bishop of Rome, sometimes called the Pope at that time, to legitimize his action. And this is going to start off a linking between the Pope and the officials who are calling themselves the heads of state. And it's going to be an important link between the head of state being given authority by the Pope. Um, and so this was a constant idea of who is more important, the Pope or the King. And it was something that was historically back and forth as far as, does the King need the Pope to tell him he's king? And it kind of started during that time. Uh, so, okay. Charlemagne built a big empire after Pepin's death. It was this Charles Martel was the first Carolingian emperor, or not really an emperor, but the first Carolingian ruler. Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, is the main one that we remember. Um, so we're gonna keep going through here. Um, we have some important things called the donation of Constantine that you want to read about. And it talks a lot about church state relations, and it has an impact on how the church and the state interacted during this time. Charlemagne built an enormous empire as far as was considered at that time by defeating all the enemies surrounding him, creating a big buffer between himself and Muslim Spain, and occupying a lot of the surrounding territories. He wanted the title emperor because he was trying to recapture the idea of the Roman Empire, and the Pope gives him the crown on Christmas Day. And this again has to do with this idea of the Pope granting the emperor this head of state power. He centralized power as much as he could, but a lot of his empire collapsed shortly after his death. His son, Louis the Pious, uh, died, leaving three sons, and then the empire split up shortly after Charlemagne's death. Um, there's this whole split, um, and it really fragmented. Uh, there was a series of Viking, Magyar, and Muslim invasions, and it was never as strong as it was under Charlemagne. So, what do you do when everything collapses? They basically kind of did this thing called retrenchment and reorganization. In some parts, they had this feudal society, is what they called it. So, basically, a vassal would pledge military service to his lord for use of the land, or the feudum or fief, for which they derived income. This pledge was part of a big ceremony, and it created stability. So while there wasn't a strong king type authority, there were these stronger, more local authorities where people had these uh, binding commitments of protection in order for land and loyalty. Manors were the dominant economic model during this period. Serfs would become tied to the land. Serfs would come along with the property to the vassal. Um, so basically, if you were a lord, you would give a knight or someone who, if you owned a lot of land, you could give some of that land to a person who would promise to fight for you during if there were ever a battle. The servants that lived on that land who farmed it would come with the land, and that person who fought for you would be able to derive his income from that land. Um, there was something called the three field rotation system to keep the soil fertile. They would basically let one field rest and then rotate that way, or sometimes they did a crop rotation. It kind of depended on where and when. Literacy declined, um, but it didn't disappear entirely. There were some people writing and there was some scholarly work, but it was much more chaotic. It wasn't like the flourishing literature of the previous age. And Greek and Roman culture, they were preserved by the monks, the theologians, and the poets. So the works of Aristotle, all those great things we saw in the Library of Alexandria, those things were being preserved in small portions, and they were not flourishing like they had been. Learning is confined to religious institutions, and training is available in small environments. Here's some cultural leaders that we see in the early Middle Ages. And then there's something of a renaissance. Priests were unable to preach because of their lack of education. So Charlemagne established schools at monasteries and cathedrals and charged Alcuin when providing a model at his own court. So basically, in order to allow uh, religion to spread, there was an educational resurgence. Um, so the liberal arts, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, and arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, these different things uh, were not as important to obviously the spread of religion, but they did still flourish some during this time. Charlemagne began to read too late and he struggled to master the skills of writing throughout his life. The Dark Age Europeans saw themselves as heirs to the Romans, but their environment was harsher and more primitive. They revered Rome's memory and they wanted to keep that image alive, but they had smaller libraries. They had just smaller, the culture was not flourishing the way it was. Their society had collapsed again and again. So while they looked back to the idea of Rome with fondness and the idea of what they had achieved in the past, they were not able to recapture that same um, glory and civilization that they looked back to. They were basically living in survival mode due to invasions and chaotic political environments. So, how does society adjust to disaster, and what does it preserve and why? So, that's kind of a nutshell of the chapter. You can read the PowerPoints that I didn't go over um, for more details